When Pokemon Sword and Shield leaked, and more information about this game got released, different waves of emotions and reactions went through the internet. Even I, who didn't participate in discussion about the leaked stuff, saw glimpses of people's reactions and their retelling about what the game was. Bad, full of graphical glitches, with routes only being straight hallways, there being no dungeons, and no difficulty whatsoever. Basically what they said was, everything about Sword and Shield sucks, except for the designs of the characters and the new Pokemon. Well, most of them anyway. So while I was still restlessly waiting to finally experience the game for myself, I started to feel very worried, something I hadn't felt since the announcement of the Dex cut in summer 2019. Well, I told myself, what do the people on gaming forums even know? They love to exaggerate, they love to panic, and they love to hate on things that I really love, like Pokemon Sun and Moon or Quilladin. It'll be fine. Well then, was it actually fine? Did I love Pokemon Sword and Shield? Do I love all of the new Pokemon, including Galarian Mr. Mime? Well, where to start? The beginning of Pokemon Sword and Shield is very interesting, in that it basically continues where Sun and Moon ended off, with cutscenes introducing the world, characters, and even new gameplay mechanics, instead of with our own characters starting their journey. Compared to Sun and Moon, it is much faster though, and you will get your starter Pokemon and your first battle soon enough. Compared to Ultra Sun and Ultra Moon, which clearly responded to the criticism of Sun and Moon's opening, or in fact previous Pokemon games, it is quite a bit longer though, but not game breaking. And while the interruptions with dialogue seem to be about the same frequency as Sun and Moon in the beginning, once the game really starts, which I would say is after the ceremony in the Motorstoke Stadium, the game becomes way less wordy, but more on that one later. Because the beginning, to me, left a very positive impression of these games. It basically starts off with what I would call the best first battle in Pokemon history, with Hop using 2 Pokemon against your sole starter. Sure, he picks the starter weak against yours, but given how much earlier they get their elemental attacks, it makes a lot of sense. At least it did from X and Y forwards, where the starters already had Ember and the like at level 5, whereas now we only get it at level 6, which you conveniently reach after defeating Hop's Wooloo. Still, what comes after the battle intrigued me very much, because our little rescue mission into Slumbering Weald ends with a mysterious encounter with a wolf-like Pokemon that, to me, who didn't look up any of the leaks, was actually really fascinating. I was sure that the Pokemon I saw was a third wolf, somehow connected to Zacian and Zamazenta, supported by the fact that its written out cry wasn't even close to either of the 2 names. And the fact that you battle against it but can't actually hurt it and the screen just becomes more and more foggy is fantastic as well. I would love it so much if Pokemon games would throw you up against unwinnable opponents more often in one way or another, so this to me was a promising sign that this game would be fantastic. But sadly, this kind of quality content isn't held throughout the rest of the game. Basically, what becomes very obvious at a certain point, it seems that only the beginning and the end of the story got the necessary time and care put into them. Everything between them feels rushed, like you're being thrown from one town and gym battle to the next. And don't get me wrong, I love how the gyms are presented in this game. Because of their visuals and the context they're presented in, they feel really new and fresh, but if you think about it, they aren't really that different from past games. Before battling a gym leader, you have to complete a challenge, and when we first read about it in the Affleck leak, I was actually kinda intrigued, since it sounded like a combination of Sun and Moon's trials somewhere in nature, and then a big battle in the stadium. Instead, it's pretty much exactly like the gym puzzles of old, which I'm absolutely fine with, it's just that a weird disparity in quality is noticeable. If you look back at the franchise, the gyms started out quite simple, with the red and blue ones being, shall I say, economical? Some of them don't even have a puzzle, and with the exception of invisible walls, quizzes, and garbage bin switch hunt terribleness, all gym puzzles are also used elsewhere in the game. Gold and Silver aren't much better, but after that the gyms were pretty much the highlight of every new gen for me. Even X and Y didn't disappoint in that regard. And Sword and Shield started out great, because instead of there being 8 gyms, like in previous games, there's actually 10. For Sword you have a fighting type and a rock type gym, and for Shield you get a ghost type and an ice type gym instead. Which means they would get different puzzles, right? Well, actually no. The puzzle areas are completely identical, they just look slightly different. Only the gym leader and some of the gym trainers look different. First though is the grass type gym. I really love this puzzle. I wonder if they always had this in mind or added it after everyone online got madly in love with Wooloo. Sure, it's not really complicated, but it fully suffices as the first of the bunch. The water type gym's puzzle might be the most classic one in the game. It isn't too hard, but you also do have to think a bit. Very solid. The Fire types puzzle is interesting because it requires you to get 5 points. Defeating a wild Pokemon yields you 1 point, catching it 2. It's a nice idea with a great twist to have the gym trainers try and sabotage you, but the fact that you can get 3 otherwise rare Pokemon here is fantastic. But in the end it feels way too simple, and in my second playthrough it became the most annoying thing. If you were curious, the Pokemon respawn if you needed more than the 3 offered battles. The fighting or ghost gym puzzle is a nice gimmick, if only for the 3 times you do it. Still, it's something completely unique, which I always appreciate, and while I kinda get how this puzzle fits a fighting type gym, it doesn't really fit for ghost types. The fairy type gym is mechanically not that amazing or involved, but I can totally forgive that because of the way the story of the gym leader, Opal, plays into this. Instead of having to solve a puzzle, you basically just battle 3 trainers, and while doing so you have to answer a few questions. If you're right, your Pokemon stats get raised. If you're wrong, they get lowered. Even in the fight against Opal, that gimmick continues, which is quite nice. It would have been even better if the questions would be about our own ambitions and ideas, since it's basically a job interview, but I can see how that would have detracted from the fighting too much. After this is the Rock or Ice type gym. I can totally understand why so many people hate this puzzle, but I think it is very well done and reminds me of the older games puzzles. I especially appreciate that you don't have to rely on the controller rumble to solve this puzzle, since you also get visual cues to avoid danger. And until this point I was actually completely fine with everything, except for the version exclusive gyms to be identical, but in a way I also kinda like it, because then I didn't really miss anything only playing one version. But the following 2 gyms basically ruined the whole experience for me. Gym 7 is the Dark type gym, which for some reason a lot of Pokemon fans always wanted to have. Well, here it is. Are you happy now? Cause I sure am not. Instead of there being a gym in the city of Spikemuth, the city of Spikemuth is the gym. The puzzle being you having to walk to the right, battling some Team Yell people, and then reaching the gym leader. At least they tried to mask this by having the Team Yell people do some fun new animations, but otherwise it's incredibly disappointing, and the variety of this not happening in a huge boring stadium also falls completely flat. It kinda reminds me of the worst trials in Sun and Moon, where you also just walked a few steps, were thrown into a battle, walked some more steps and battled again. This disappointment is only reinforced by the fact that Spikemuth is really just a Pokemon Center and a gym, which made me really sad, but more on that later. The final gym is once again a Dragon type gym. The first ill sign is the fact that there are basically just 5 minutes of gameplay between the 7th and the 8th gym, but a great puzzle could definitely compensate for that. Are we gonna fight between lava again? Do we have to move giant dragon statues so we can walk up on their backs towards the gym leader? No, we get nothing. It's just 3 battles against the gym trainers, one after the other. There isn't even a unique environment to fight them in. Instead it happens in the incredibly important and very fragile Hammerlock Vault, where all the important and valuable goods of the city, maybe even the whole region, are stored. But sure, make it rain in here, it's fine. Of course, this was probably done because of time constraints, so instead of creating a new environment with textures and everything, they just used this one they already had. I do like that this gym at least has the gimmick of them all using weather strategies and every battle being a double battle, which really should happen more. This at least makes the gym stand out a tiny bit. At least all the gym leader battles themselves are incredibly well done, and the leaders themselves are all really unique and cool personalities, with fantastic animations and impeccable character design. The atmosphere when battling in the huge stadiums, or even just before that, is really fantastic, amplified even more by the music, which is very dynamic if you haven't noticed. It doesn't properly start until you both have sent out your Pokemon, it gets really muffled when you're in the menu choosing a Pokemon, and it changes over the duration of the battle. The small quips the characters throw in are really cool as well, like Raihan mentioning changes of the weather and all that. Makes the battles feel more connected to the world. Really, everything about them is fantastic. The problem is that the context these gyms are presented in is really flawed. Especially the pacing of the game, where I don't understand what they were going for. The beginning, and by that I count everything until first entering the wild area, feels really tight. You are slowly introduced to the characters and rules of the world, as well as the gameplay, with the wolf battle being the obvious highlight of it all. After that, you get to freely explore the wild area, which is absolutely fantastic and feels very freeing, especially after the constant talking in the beginning. Then things start to get really weird, because once you reach Motostoke, you still aren't even close to getting your first badge. Instead you have the big ceremony that introduces all the gym leaders, which is really fantastic by the way, especially because the Dark-type gym leader Pierce isn't here, making him quite the mystery. Then you have the introduction to Team Yell and the introduction to both Marnie and Bede, the main plot of the world with the hero statue, and a meeting with Rose, the eventual, for some reason, villain of this game. Only after that, and 2 more routes and a dungeon, do you reach the town of the first gym, which means that it will take you quite a while of playing until you even get there. It took me 6 hours, and I bet some people took even longer, given how much you can do in the wide area, which I will discuss later. To me, it kinda feels like the original plan was for the entire game to be this embellished. Maybe not 6 hours between every gym embellished, but something much more than we eventually got. Because after the first gym, the game seems to accelerate incredibly fast out of seemingly nowhere. From the start of the game to the first gym, you travel through 2 towns, 4 routes and 1 dungeon. From the first to the second gym, you have 1 route. From the second to the third gym, you have 1 dungeon and 1 area that I would count as a route, though the game labels it as Motorstoke Outskirts. This discrepancy is only really noticeable because of how long it takes you from the start of the game to the first gym. You could count the ceremony as the actual beginning of the gym challenge story, but that still doesn't excuse the hours of nothingness before that, which are made even worse by the level design. When I first read some slight spoilers about these games online, this was one of them. People claiming that the level design is really bad, with routes being linear corridors and dungeons never even exceeding the complexity of Viridian Forest. And my first reaction to that was to not believe it, because I know how it is on the internet. People are constantly exaggerating, dramatizing and misunderstanding everything, and then communicate those feelings through terribly written, both grammatically and rationally, forum posts. I remember how they talked about Sun & Moon's level design, which was criticized the exact same way, even though it most definitely wasn't as bad as people made it out to be. So I kept a cool head and waited for the game to come out, so I could judge it for myself. And what I found was of varying quality. If you only look at the main road, then yeah, obviously many routes are only linear paths. But that doesn't mean there isn't anything to explore or do on the sidelines. Sure, there isn't much, but honestly my standards have dropped so low that I really appreciate the stuff that is there. Like the little lake area on Route 5, or literally the majority of Route 4. And there are honestly routes that are absolutely fantastic, like Route 6, Route 8 or Route 9, even though they could have been a bit bigger and there could have been more than just 3 of them. And more than 10 total as well. I know we kinda have to factor and count the wild area into this somehow as well, but since it doesn't have trainer battles or real level design, I'm very reluctant to do so. I don't know why the fact that there are only 10 routes feels so terrible to me, and I'm not even talking about you already having finished 4 of them before even getting your first badge. Like, people love to hate on Sun & Moon and how small Alola was, but it had more than this, and areas like Mount Hokulani, 10 Carat Hill, and all the Eastern Pony Island stuff. Which, by the way, were all optional, which this game doesn't have anything of. Speaking of the Eastern Pony Island stuff, how come the meager 3DS games have more interesting level and graphical design than the shiny new Switch games? Is there a place in Sword and Shield that looks as interesting as Pony Meadow does? I honestly don't think so. At least when it comes to towns and cities, Sword and Shield are far better than Sun and Moon to me. Without gyms, the Alola region didn't really have a need for towns. With Sword and Shield, it's the exact opposite. With gyms now being giant stadiums, you need bigger towns than ever to make them not weirdly stand out, and for the most part I guess they did a good job with it. Like, the only stadium that was a bit weird was the one in Ballonlea, and while the small forest village looks really beautiful with all its glowing mushrooms, I have to say it's one of the few really disappointing cities of the game. I love the towns of Dragon Quest XI so much, and I guess for most JRPGs, towns are my favorite thing to explore, but I don't really know what exactly makes a town great to me. What I definitely don't like is having only a few houses to explore, and while Ballonlea doesn't have a lot of that, it's still somehow far beyond Spikemuth, or as I call it, Po-Town, but even less. Or Turffield, both of which are literally just places with a Pokemon Center and a gym. That's it. And it stands out so much because all the other cities, Halbury, Motorstoke, Kirchester, Hammerlock and Wyndon, are great and have a lot of NPCs to talk to. Sure, they're not even close to perfect. Like, once again I want to mention Dragon Quest XI, which gave every NPC in every city pretty much a dozen lines of dialogues throughout the game, which was used to tell small stories and jokes and make you believe the world wasn't actually lived in place. Pokemon is basically nothing like that, although Sun and Moon had a few people whose dialogue changed after certain events. The towns are a step in the right direction after Sun and Moon though, and while I said I don't think they're even remotely perfect, I genuinely don't understand the dismay of a lot of people who seem to really dislike the towns of Sword and Shield. The most interesting settlement to me is Stormsight. What a weird name. What is wrong with the English localization of Pokemon games? While it isn't much bigger in scope than Ballonlea, it features some neat verticality and hidden stuff, which we really need more of in general. We also need a lot more of our dungeons, because this game doesn't really have any. I mean seriously, the 3, arguably 4 dungeons of the game, Galar Mine 1 and 2, Glimwood Tangle and Slumbering Weald, are all honestly even less complex than Route 8 or 9 if you think about it. And there isn't even a victory road. Sure, Sun and Moon didn't have that either, but Vast Pony Canyon at least kinda fit that profile, until Ultra Sun and Ultra Moon added a lot to Mount Lanakila. The closest this time would be either Route 10 or the last part of Slumbering Wealds, but I don't think anyone would really be impressed by that. Like, Game Freak has shown that they can still design more or less complex dungeons in 3D with Vast Pony Canyon, so the decision to not have anything even remotely similar to it in Sword and Shield is really baffling to me. But I think I have an idea of why that is: the lack of HMs. HMs, from the beginning of the Pokemon franchise, had 2 clear objectives. First, to be incredibly annoying and make it so you really can't use the Pokemon team you really wanted to, because you needed to be able to surf and fly and strength your way through the world. The other purpose was to make the world a more interesting place to explore. How many of you walked past the cuttable plants on Route 2 back in Red and Blue, saw the items behind the rocks or bushes or whatever these things were supposed to be, and wondered when you could get there? I sure did. I still remember most places where you can find rocks to push or ledges to climb, but didn't have the HM to do that yet. Sun and Moon updated the HM mechanic with the right Pokemon, which the Let's Go games even iterated upon. And now Sword and Shield's continuation of that is basically nothing. The only thing that comes close to it is the bike, which can eventually drive on water, but even with that there are only 3 places you have already visited, outside of the wide area, that have stuff hidden behind water, 2 of which are literally just 1 item and nothing more. The Metroidvania effect of wondering, when will I be able to do this and what will be behind this, is completely non-existent in these games, so I wonder why anybody would prefer this to the solution Game Freak already had with Sun and Moon. It definitely wasn't perfect, mostly because of its convenience. Every breakable rock after the first island was kinda weird, because everybody had Tauros and could summon it with just 1 button press, so they felt more like a nuisance instead of the Rock Smash Rocks of games past, where you always knew that if you hadn't wasted a move slot on one of your Pokemon, you wouldn't be able to smash this rock, so you can read the sign that tells you about smashing rocks. I for one would rather have giant boulders or waterfalls blocking my way than a team Yell Grunts practicing their chanting, or 2 unimportant NPCs having a regular conversation on the middle of the road and my character deciding to turn around and not go past them for some reason. So without proper dungeons, reason to explore past areas, and most routes, of which there aren't even that many, being very simple and short, it's no wonder these games feel so weirdly short and lacking in a lot of regards. But it gets even worse, because there's another thing all these issues lead to that makes these games feel empty. There aren't a lot of trainer battles. Rival battles, sure there are a lot. You actually fight Hop once more than you found How in Sun and Moon, and with Beat and Marnie you have 2 more rivals, but it's just Gladion and Sun and Moon. And you do fight trainers in the gyms, whereas you mostly just fought wild Pokemon in the trials, but other than that, there's a weird lack of trainer battles in these games, and I have an idea of why that might be, other than there just not being a lot of content in general. It's the XP share item. Since X and Y, the XP share has made it so that in a regular battle, it will magically spawn 50% experience points for every Pokemon in your party that didn't partake in the battle, whereas past XP shares split the awarded experience points with 1 selected member of the party. XP has been kinda busted since X and Y because they completely took the concept of splitting XP away. Now every Pokemon that took part in a battle gets 100% of the XP it would get, instead of sharing the awarded amount with every other active Pokemon. That, as well as the awarded XP from catching Pokemon, has led to the games basically burying you in experience points, with Sword and Shield just being the latest installment of this joyride, thanks to the XP candy rewarded in max raid battles. And don't get me wrong, I love them. Ever since playing Yokai Watch I've wanted these in a Pokemon game. I first noticed the lack of trainer battles when thinking about the trainer classes of this game. You know, youngster, lass, that kind of stuff. And I remembered the Fisher trainer class, which I mostly encountered in the wild area, and noticed that you only fight 2 of them in the entire game, both located on and around Route 9. Youngsters, you only fight them on Route 2. Lasses, 1 is on Route 2, 1 on Route 3. That's it. The school children, only on Route 3. The kids in the Pikachu and Eevee costumes, only on Route 4, and only 2 of each. Who designed this? That's like buying 10 plants to decorate your house in The Sims and then putting all of them in the same corner of only 1 room. Let's compare this to an older route from Gold and Silver, Route 32. On the optional docks are 3 fisherman trainers, which is already more than Sword and Shield has in its entire region. and there are way more fishermen in Johto, and Kanto for that matter, than just on this route, in addition to even more trainer battles to be had with dozens of other trainer classes. Even Sun and Moon was better in that regard, because while most routes and places didn't have many more individual trainer battles in them, there are just a lot more areas to begin with in Alola than in the whole of Galar. And honestly, that could have been easily fixed if only the wild area was designed differently. So I guess we should talk about the wild area in more detail now. The heart of these new games, and the first step into a new direction for the Pokemon mainline games. Because to me, the wild area feels very much like only a first step into something that could expand over the next couple of games and will probably already be expanded upon in the DLC. But the way the wild area exists in the main game, it's not too impressive. There's just way too much about this wide open area that is just plain weird and too bad for me to completely enjoy it. But the potential for greatness is very much there. When you first enter the wild area, which happens very early in the game, you notice that you can only really find old Pokemon in this first of two sections. Sure, you can easily walk over to the later half and find tons of new Pokemon, but since they're too high level to catch, which is a very bad mechanic that could have been dealt with in so many different, much better ways than they actually decided to do, there is no real point in actually exploring the wild area. Sure, you can find a couple of TMs and useful items, but other than raids there isn't much to do here. I would have very much preferred a more free approach, since I always appreciate it when we can individualize our teams as early as possible. The wild area is perfect for this, or rather would be. Like, I very much appreciate this incredibly early daycare, but since you can only get Ditto and many other Pokemon really late, it doesn't really work out for me. Some other things that can be easily fixed in later iterations are the weirdly limited camera, which was way too restrictive in many places, like cliffs or if you just wanted to get an overview of a huge patch of grass. That was very annoying. Or the weather, which is handled incredibly weirdly, with it varying between the different small zones of the wild area, meaning if you travel through it, you will walk through rain, hot sunshine, a sandstorm and snow all in a single trip, or within just 2 minutes. An actually dynamic weather system that doesn't just change once a day would have been fantastic and would have made this place a lot more believable, as would a lot more regular NPCs. The way it is now, there's one breeder who will battle you with the starters, and some randomly placed backpackers, fishes and leak stuff people, which will quickly feel way too artificial and boring. You could play online, which makes the wild area feel even a bit too crowded, but that only breaks the performance and doesn't offer much in terms of interactions. In that way, it feels also kinda like a prototype online hub, but doesn't even come close to reaching the Pokemon MMO of people's streams. For that, the wild area is also way too small, and for the main game, it's also incredibly underutilized. If you don't constantly go back here between badges, you only have to enter the wild area twice, because it only basically connects two cities, Motostoke and Hammerlock. It would have been much better if we were led through the wild area more often during the main story, since now there's only really 4 times it becomes interesting or necessary to your playthrough. First on your way to Motostoke, second on your way to Hammerlock, fourth in post-game, and third after you get the bike upgrade to ride on water. Because that's when the Lake of Outrage opens up, probably the most interesting part of the wild area, because this is where you will find some of the most rare Pokemon in the game. You can theoretically find Rotom, Ditto, or the beloved Dreepy and Evolution here, but they don't just have incredibly small encounter rates, they also only spawn in certain weather conditions, so if you're really unlucky, you might have to wait several days to get them, which is just plain bad in my opinion. The last interesting thing to do in the wild area are the raid battles. These are battles of 4 trainers against 1 giant, really strong Pokemon, showing off the Dynamax feature, which I will talk about after these raid battles, because I have a lot of problems with them. First off, they take way too long. Even with animations turned off, you're going to sit on each one for a while, and if you play online, it turns the animations on automatically. If it would at least also skip the Dynamaxing animation or things like Pokemon taking damage from weather effects, it would be much faster, but no, raids are incredibly tedious no matter what. Which is a shame because they can be quite tricky and fun, but that kind of fun is, at least to me, very hard to have since the game tries everything it can to make the experience miserable for you. First, the fact that it's 4 players against 1 Pokemon. Since you either play with NPCs or random people online you can't communicate with, strategizing becomes basically impossible, so you always resort to the basic, doing a lot of damage while staying alive approach, which gets old very quickly. You can try to think ahead of what the other people might do, but you can never really be certain, especially with the NPCs. Like, there have been a lot of memes about this, but I just have to reiterate how shit the raid NPCs the game offers are. The game, seemingly at random, picks 3 out of 20 possible pre-made NPCs to help you in your fight, but what they actually do is try to destroy your life. Later raid difficulties will have the Pokemon guarding itself with a shield that can only be destroyed by regular attacks of the separate Pokemon. Yet somehow, someone at Game Freak thought it would be an amazing idea to add a character with a Wobbuffet or a character with a Solrock who loves using buffs, even though the raid Pokemon have the ability to dispel every stat change every couple of turns. Or a character with an Eevee, which loves to use Helping Hand, even though it literally doesn't help at all. Throughout the game I hoped that in post-game all these terrible NPCs get changed, because it kinda makes sense for them to be bad in the beginning. But nope, the Magikarp girl still uses her Magikarp, the Mudbray boy still uses his Mudbray, and the Togepi woman still uses her Togepi. Have you ever wondered why Togepi despises you and doesn't evolve? Maybe because you let it die in raids constantly, Catherine? And she's also endangering the whole raid, since they automatically end once 4 Pokemon got knocked out. Meaning if you genuinely want to win against 5-star raid Pokemon, you have to use the online mode of the game and hope to find people who want to join you, cause otherwise you're gonna need a whole lot of luck. And while it's generally great that you can easily get otherwise hard to get Pokemon through these raid battles, even version exclusive ones thanks to online sharing, they do kinda end up being very formulaic. Every 5-star raid Pokemon summons shields twice in a battle and always at predetermined HP percentages. It happened way too often that my Pokemon used a strong attack that should have made a lot of damage, only for the game to basically cheat and only subtract 5 of its hundreds of HP just because at that point it was supposed to summon the shield. That's just such a cheap way to handle these otherwise pretty engaging battles, and I really wish they would have put some more creativity into them. Shields are fun, but they are basically the only variants you will get throughout the difficulties. A bit more would have been appreciated. And why are the catch rates so terrible? Don't get me wrong, I immediately caught almost all raid Pokemon during my playthrough, but once I got to the post-game and all the actually great Pokemon started to spawn, I suddenly had a lot of problems catching them, which is bad since you only get one chance to throw a ball, and once you defeat a raid Pokemon you can't rebattle it, which gets incredibly frustrating when they are Gigantamax Pokemon you fight against. These fights don't just add onto the already pretty damning problems of the regular raid battles, but the fact that they're so rare and simultaneously hard to catch is such an obvious way to stretch the post-game that it's just ridiculous. I genuinely love the new forms of the Pokemon, but there are so many problems with Gigantamaxing, it really sours the whole mechanic for me. Like, I didn't expect all the gym leaders from the third one on, and all other main characters, to use Gigantamax. It was definitely a great surprise, but it only makes it worse that we ourselves are not really able to use Gigantamaxing during a regular playthrough. In a game that finally, after so many games, makes it really easy for you to make the Pokemon you use during your playthrough perfect, the decision to make Gigantamax exclusive to Pokemon caught in specific max raid battles will be eternally frustrating to me. Like, they show you a better version of a Pokemon you might have in your party and then tease you with the fact that yours will never be as cool as the gym leader's one because it isn't special enough. I can't stress enough how terrible this decision is, and there are incredibly easy ways to make it better. For example, already in the game exists an ingredient for curry that's called Gigantamix. When I first heard about it, I thought that this would simply unlock the ability to Gigantamax for every Pokemon that eats it and has a corresponding Gigantamax form. But nope, it's just a regular ingredient that makes curry be big. How lame is that? And what an easy way that would have been to fix the issue. Like, I get why they don't do that, since both Snorlax and Toxicity have Gigantamax forms that, at launch, couldn't be accessed, so an item like this would have kinda ruined whatever they were going for there. But that still doesn't excuse the overall bad decision, which is frustrating because I absolutely adore most of the Gigantamax designs. Which brings me to my next issue. Since these games are the first since the introduction of Mega Evolution to scrap this feature, we have to assume that Gigantamaxing and the corresponding forms of the Pokemon will at some point, and I would guess rather sooner than later, no longer be available. And while I can see most new Pokemon still having uses without their forms, it won't ever feel right to use them without these. And conversely, it feels weird to have a game with Mawile in it, but without its Mega Evolution, even though they could have easily repurposed the design and model for Gigantamaxing. Though I guess it and all the other converted Megas would have needed a specific attack as well, and would be way less useful, but whatever. This is also I guess why with X and Y, they didn't introduce Mega Evolution for the newly added Pokemon. Only Gen 1 through 4 got Mega Evolutions back then, with Gens 5 and 6 getting one each in Auras. Looking back now, it makes a whole lot of sense, since I already had a strong connection to all the regular Pokemon that got a Mega, so now without it, there isn't anything important missing, with exceptions like Mawile. But with the new 8th generation Pokemon also getting Gigantamax forms, which by the way is more than any other generation got in Gigantamax forms, it will definitely feel like there's something missing when the next games are gonna inevitably scrap the feature entirely. Even though, honestly, most of these forms would be perfectly fine as Mega Evolutions too. Just make them a bit smaller and take away the terrible red shader and you're done. Anyway, let's go back to Dynamax as a gameplay feature. It's hard for me to gauge its usage in the battle system since I'm not a competitive player. I can and will however comment on the feature as it is used during the single player game, and my conclusion is that it is used completely incorrectly. My impression of the design decision behind Dynamax is that theoretically you could pull the Dynamax trigger potentially during every single turn of a battle, if the situation warrants or demands it. With Mega Evolutions and Z moves, you were always very restricted in who could use this power-up feature. Now every Pokemon can use it, no matter what item they're holding. So theoretically there is this looming threat every battle of when your opponent is going to use their Dynamax and how you are going to respond to it. In reality though, that is never actually the case, because after Nessa you will have probably realized that every NPC that can Dynamax will only use it immediately on their very last Pokemon, no matter what you do. That completely takes the surprise factor out of the equation and opens up some stupidly easy opportunities for the players. If they would at least respond to your Dynamax by throwing out their aces instead of throwing out the rest of their team first just to basically die in one hit, it would be much better. Still, I appreciate that Game Freak has learned since X and Y. Remember how Mega Evolution was like a big deal in that game and then until the end of it only like 3 people ever used it? That was really stupid. You know what's also stupid? The online system of this game. You all were hating on the Festival Plaza back in Sun and Moon, but at least it had all the established features of the mainline Pokemon games. When it was first announced, the YCOM looked promising, like the successor to the PSS we always wanted. Sadly, it turned out to be something quite different, if still somehow the same idea. It never quite works the way you want it to though, with the game mostly auto-searching for random people online and not really giving you any kind of control over any of it. Still, even with the limited uses available, people online were able to circumvent most problems with the YCOM, but problems like the game loving to continually display stickers for raid battles or trades, even though their players have already stopped searching for connections, will persist. What really stinks though is the fact that the online system costs money to use now and still feels as clunky and weird as the 3DS ones. Whereas yet, it also doesn't even have all the features, with the GTS having been cut. Sure, with it being put for free into Pokemon Home and there only being around 400 Pokemon available in Sword and Shield as of right now, it kinda makes sense to leave the GTS out of the individual games. But for those first few months, even though the community online has managed to make a similar system work with the passcodes, it was just terrible and I regret completing my Pokédex like that. While I did eventually do that, it never felt as fun or comfortable as it did with the help of the GTS. Because instead of being able to trade for the Pokemon I want with the people that offer them, I had to rely on randomly being connected with random people with whom I could not communicate in the slightest. The most effort I've seen people put in was to write their specific request as the nicknames of their first offered Pokemon, which is just a terrible way to do things. I've had so many terrible encounters with people who just didn't have what I wanted and didn't quite want what I offered, so I just had to rudely disconnect from them, which always felt bad and tedious. Seriously, getting a Storm Journey should not have been that hard. I feel like Game Freak at least tried to alleviate for the fact that a lot of people will just not be able to go online, since it's a paid service now, by putting some of the trade evolutions either as encounters in the wild area or into raid battles. So you can easily get the Slurpuff even without trading if you really want to and put the time into it to get it, even as a Shield player if you can find a shared raid online. And without any newly introduced Pokemon requiring trades, I do think a good balance has been found. Still, without the GTS, with online being paid only and with the YCOM not working as smoothly as it should, the online system for Sword and Shield is actually pretty underwhelming. And speaking of things that are underwhelming, how about we talk about the story and characters for a bit? To say the story is completely bad might be incorrect, but I bet there isn't anybody out there who thinks this story is well told. I've already talked about the beginning of the game and that I quite liked it, but pretty much everything between this moment and the literal avalanche of story right before the end of the game is incredibly weird and often outright bad. What I enjoyed were pretty much all the encounters with Sonia, who either taught you or learned together with you something about the Galar region lore. I loved how the game even tries to involve you into the piecing together of new information, but honestly and sadly, the lore is so simple and unrewarding that it doesn't really work out in the end. It's still much better than whatever they tried to tell with Rose and Eternatus though. Like, I kinda think there's an interesting story hidden somewhere in there, but sadly it all happens too fast and with too little actually being told, so that the story doesn't even really begin before it's already over. And sadly it all happens at the worst possible time. I felt genuinely cockblocked, since Rose starts doing the bad thing just as you are finally about to fight Leon, which of course has to wait until this Eternatus thing is over. It makes this whole arc feel even worse, and I really get it if people just try to hurry through all of it. Which would kinda be a shame, because I also feel that everything that happens above Hammerlock Gym is really cool and a lot of fun. Especially fighting together with Zacian, Zamazenta and Hop against Eternamax Eternatus. The story is, to me, one of the most obvious signs that this game was incredibly rushed. Like, you wouldn't see that weird goose chase through Winden trying to catch that weird Macrocosmos guy otherwise. The writing, at least in the German version, also makes it stand out weirdly, since people all of a sudden talk about the evil guys and all that, with a character later pretty much saying, "No, I'm one of the good ones," which is always a stupid thing to read or hear. Another very obvious sign this game was rushed, which results in the story being garbage, are the constant interruptions that get resolved by other characters. For example, there is an explosion in Hammerlock just after getting the 5th gym badge, obviously hinting at the experiments that would later unleash Eternatus. I bet that we were originally supposed to check what went wrong in the labs under the gym, but because of time constraints they couldn't program the scenes or a possible dungeon or whatnot, so instead we get Leon, who tells us that he will check it out and that we should only focus on our gym challenge. It makes it feel like this game is trying to eat its cake and have it too, because it might also be read as a response to Sun and Moon's criticism of them having way too many stops and cutscenes. By trying to tell a story, but it not interfering with your regular gameplay, they could have had it both, but sadly it just makes all of the game feel worse. After the 4th batch it feels like you're being rushed through the game without anything of relevance happening, only for the story to come crashing down all at once at the end of the game. Just imagine how much better the game would feel if we would have our first encounter with the Macrocosmos people after that explosion in a classic Pokemon style dungeon, with us starting to learn about Rose's plans, not directly but by reading documents that are scattered throughout, just like with Mewtwo on Cinnabar Island. And then after the Dark-type gym, have us actually fight against the Dynamax Pokemon instead of having Leon finish it before we even get there, so there is at least a little bit of stuff to do before the last 2 gym badges. But even then you would probably still need a complete rewrite, because I honestly don't understand Rose's problem. Like, he wanted to prevent a bad thing from happening in 1000 years. Alright, fine. But why does it have to be the one day where Leon says he's busy fighting with us? Literally, if Rose chose to do it one day, or let's just say 1 hour after the final battle against Leon, wouldn't that fix everything? Or would Eternatus still do whatever bad thing it is supposed to be doing? What was Leon's part in all of this? There's so many holes in the story that even I, someone who literally never notices these kind of plot holes, was completely dumbstruck by all of it. Like, if you just move the energy problem from happening in 1000 to 5 or 10 years from now, that would immediately improve the story. Add something like a rare comet made out of wishing pieces that only shows up in the sky for 1 day every 100 years, and have that be the reason why it has to happen immediately, and pretty much most of the problems with this story would have been fixed. But given that they had to resort to using still frames of Rose and Leon talking, instead of it being a regularly animated cutscene, I doubt that something as insignificant as the plot should have been focused on in the last stretch of development. So let's talk about the characters for a bit. Pokemon Sun and Moon were the first Pokemon games where I really got into the characters, both from a design standpoint and a story standpoint as well. So it made sense to expect Sword and Shield to follow suit. But as we have already discussed, Sword and Shield really turned down the amount of dialogue, which sadly doesn't just gut the plot of the game, but also the characters and their development. For the main characters, Hop and Sonia, this isn't the case however. To me they're the strongest stories of the bunch, which is a problem because I also feel they're the least interesting, at least from a potential story standpoint. Pretty much every other character you meet in the game feels more interesting than those the game actually focuses on. For Hop, that led to a lot of people despising him. After Hau from Sun and Moon, he felt like a copy of that kind of character. They both even have a family member who is stronger than them and they look up to. Over the course of the game though, Hop felt a lot more developed than Hau in the end, even though the biggest problem for his character development is the fact that Game Freak really doesn't want you to lose to him ever. at least until the very last fight in the post-game story, which totally wrecked me. Hao actually defeated me a couple of times with his stupid Raichu, but Hop never even came close, which shouldn't be an issue, because at one point in the story he becomes very depressed after losing a fight against Beat, and then kinda falls completely behind you, even constantly losing against gym leaders. I like that this makes him change up his team now and again, but I never really feel like the game commits to this change in his situation. It's just not made for that, given how you constantly have to move forward to the next town with the next gym. In the end, he bounces back for the big showdown in Winden Stadium, where he obviously also loses to you, but at least he is now one of the strongest trainers in Galar and self-assured of his worth. Only for then to lose to the Sword or Shield guy in the post-game story, which starts off those events. I felt that this was completely unnecessary and kinda makes it feel like the developers didn't really know how they wanted to develop his character. It makes sense for him to try and find his own place in the world and not just try to copy his older brother, but him wanting to become a professor in the end feels, I don't know, kinda unfitting. It's a very unsatisfying ending, especially compared to basically every character ending we got in Sun and Moon. And speaking of professors, Professor Magnolia. She exists, I think. Moving on to Sonia, who I was actually surprised to see this often in the game. When she was revealed, I was confused as to what role she would play, and I actually enjoyed discovering the past of the Galar region with her. She even takes over as professor after her grandmother in a cool little scene. I always like changes to a character's appearance throughout the story, but I think it would have been better to actually include Professor Magnolia into the story a bit more, showing her observe Sonia's work, so that the decision for her to give up her coat doesn't come out of literally nowhere. Marnie is a very interesting character who gets way too little screen time way too late in the game. I think I would have enjoyed her story more if she would have decided to stay in Spikemuth after all the events there, which I really loved by the way, and take care of the city in her brother's stead, instead of continuing on and trying to become champ. This way she doesn't even really have a part in the post-game story, although there are some way too hidden ways to fight her as a gym leader, which is nice at least, but still too late. It would have a much bigger impact to see her visibly change during the game story, and also maybe take part in some more of it, akin to her older brother Pierce. He wasn't really a big player during the story, although he is probably the gym leader with the most scenes, thanks to his help in Winden, but in the post-game he appeared a lot more, making him stand out as a positive example of how it should have been for everybody. Beat's story might be my favorite of the entire game, even though I wish it was handled completely differently. He starts off as the kind of jerk rival that a lot of people missed. I never did, and here it's shown once again why. His characterization doesn't work. It isn't hard to defeat him, and once you do, none of what he says, no matter how cocky, feels deserved, just stupid and senseless. So to see him actually be disqualified from the gym challenge was quite surprising, and while I suspected that we would see Opal choose her successor in the game, I didn't expect it to be Beat. It does work quite well in the end, but I wish we would have seen some kind of training or anything to make this transition of his character a bit smoother. Still one of the best things to happen in this game. I've already talked about Rose, but I just have to mention how absurdly weird his sudden shift in characterization is. At first he seems lovable and even kinda clumsy, especially with his stupid undercover outfit, but then all of a sudden he's mad and crazy and bad? But all of that is still not as disappointing to me as Oleana, who seemed shady from the very beginning. Everything she did made me suspect that she was actually the one in charge, playing naive Rose and using him to reach her goal. But then all of a sudden she's just crazy and obsessed with serving him without any real motivation of her own. From a character standpoint, she might be the biggest letdown and missed chance of the entire cast of this game, if not the whole Pokemon franchise. For the other characters, I feel very disappointed as well. All of the gym leaders have such superb character design, and a lot of stuff, mostly told through the leak cards, that could potentially be used in the game's story, but none of it ever comes up. Like, who is Alistair and where has he learned to fight like that at such a young age? Why can't we learn anything about Kabu's past and his origins in the Hoenn region? Why do they tell us about the troubled relationship of Melanie and her son Gordy if the characters don't even exist together in any of the games? Compare that to the trial captains and kahunas of Sun and Moon, who all had way more screen time than any of the gym leaders of Sword and Shield, especially with their side quests. You could even visit pretty much all of their homes. Seeing their rooms and families made them incredibly relatable, compared to anything the gym leaders do in Sword and Shield. And in the end, I have to say that there is not a single person in Sword and Shield as memorable or fun as, for example, Guzma from Sun and Moon. And originally I was pretty sure that the third version would fix all the issues I had with the stories and gave the characters more stuff to do. But now that Game Freak has announced that they are not going to release a revised version of Sword and Shield and will instead do DLC that adds to the original game, I want to talk about the things that change brings with it, because it is very much not all positive. Unless they actively change stuff from the main game, akin to Mass Effect Andromeda, the story will always be this lackluster and dumb. The Dragon-type gym will forever be stupid, and Spikemouth will forever be one of the worst cities. Remember when X and Y came out, and we all hoped for that version to come out and fix all the terrible issues that game had? Remember when Diamond and Pearl had a lot of problems, and finally Platinum came out and is still one of the favorite games of many people? The potential for DLC being great for this franchise is there, sure, and I very much support the thesis that it was a disgusting business practice to sell third versions in the first place, but I cannot pretend like there was no great potential in them as a concept, and for Sword and Shield's third version in particular. Should Game Freak, against all odds, do change some stuff in free patches, I will be incredibly happy of course, but I do not think it will happen. And since the first DLC, the Isle of Armor, can be accessed after first arriving in a wild area, there will probably be no interactions with any of the characters from the main game, and I doubt that this will happen in the second DLC either. Now let's talk about the new Pokemon. I absolutely love all of them. Luckily I was able to avoid all leaks and didn't even watch the last trailer, so I got the, in my mind, perfect experience of playing a new Pokemon game and actually encountering new Pokemon. Lots of them in fact, which I really forgot about how great it felt. And while I didn't immediately love a couple of the new Pokemon at first look, by now I pretty much adore each and every one of them, with some of them as my new favorite Pokemon of them all. I think Inteleon is absolutely fantastic, I love all the new Bug-type Pokemon to bits, Phalanx might be one of my absolute favorite ideas of them all, Pincurchin is absolutely adorable, and the fossils are amazing in my opinion, even if I do get how you can absolutely hate them when first seeing them. And the idea of regional evolutions is absolutely fantastic, and I'm not just saying this because one of my all-time favorite lines got a Galarian form with Yamask, and that a great regional evolution with Runerigus. For the regional forms, I do like how slow Game Freak keeps it, because Sun and Moon gave 10 old Pokemon lines, all from Kanto of course, new forms, and Sword and Shield do 10 again, pre-DLC that is. This time spread over a few more generations. It doesn't feel as much though because of the split regional evolutions, which I think is a fantastic feature, even though I don't quite get why Runerigus had to be its own Pokemon, and I will forever mourn the fact that regular Corsola, Farfetch'd or Mr. Mime will probably never get evolutions. Oh, and yeah, even Galarian Mr. Mime grew on me, but not as much as Mr. Rhyme did. The English names, however, will always be terrible to me. I do still have some problems though, like some Pokemon only occurring way too late in the game, like Eiscue or Stormjourner, and that Reapy can basically never be used in a regular playthrough because its evolution is way too late and it doesn't even learn any decent attacks. It would be less terrible if there would be enough post-game content to use it in, but Jangmo was much better in that regard. Also, I feel like the type variety is way off in these games. With Galarian, Rapidash and Hatterene, we have 2 new Psychic Fairy types, and we got more new Ice types than basically ever before, but in terms of variety there is a lot left to desire. Why do so many Pokemon only have one type? Like Berserker or Copperajah are both pure Steel type Pokemon, or Grablocked, Sirfetch'd and Phalanx are all pure Fighting type. That sadly does dampen my enjoyment of these new Pokemon, and compared to Sun and Moon it was way harder to come up with half a dozen well-balanced teams to play through these games. Which brings us to the gameplay. The most important change you will have to deal with throughout the game is how the wild Pokemon are treated. Instead of only bringing back random encounters or the overworld Pokemon from Let's Go, Sword and Shield try a mixed approach. You still have overworld Pokemon, but while walking through the tall grass, you can get random encounters too. So you will basically never be thrown into a battle you didn't want to be in, except when an overworld Pokemon like Sneasel tries to charge you down. Thanks to these kinds of behaviors, and the fact that there are only few Pokemon per patch of grass, help make the overworld Pokemon feel much more nuanced than in Let's Go. In the wild area there are a lot more of them though, which makes sense given how much wider it is than every other place in the Galar region. And the fact that there are still random encounters is great as well, giving us basically the best of both worlds. There are a few problems with this approach though. First, with the random encounters not just happening to you, but you having to actively start them, it can be a bit tedious if you're just trying to find a rare Pokemon or battle, because the overworld Pokemon love to be in the way and waste your time. And you often do want to look at some random encounters, because some Pokemon are only found in those, never being seen in the overworld. Blipbug, for example, can only be found as a random encounter, except in Slumbering Wheels, which you can only properly enter at the end of the story. Or Sizzlepete only being a 1% random encounter and just plain not existing as an overworld spawn. I don't really get why they decided to do that. I guess they wanted to make some Pokemon more rare than others, but it makes everything just more tedious and weird. Another problem is the XP share, which functions exactly like it did since X and Y, without the function to turn it off however. I've already mentioned some of its problems, but to me, as someone who always played with it turned off, except for when my team was falling behind level-wise, I dreaded it so much. And it proved to be just as terrible as I had feared. My first team was a Boltund, which I sadly was pretty much never able to use. I always try to have my team be around the same level, and without XP share that means that I have to use all of my team pretty regularly. The problem is though that some Pokemon need less experience points to level up than others. So where Pincurchin needs 1 million XP to reach level 100, Boltund only needs 800,000. The starter Pokemon need a bit more than 1 million, whereas the fossil Pokemon need 1,250,000. So with a system that pretty much rewards the same amount of experience points to every Pokemon, that means that some Pokemon level much quicker than others. And for my Boltund that meant that I couldn't really use it as often because I always saw how much higher it was in levels compared to the rest of my team, even though it always only got 50% of the XP. If I have a Pokemon in my party, I also want to use it. Add the fact that there are less trainer battles than ever before in this game, and you can guess why I really don't feel like I've had as much of a connection to my Sword and Shield teams than any other Pokemon team I've had in the past. And while we're talking about levels, I should talk a bit about the balancing of the game. One of the defenses for taking away the option to turn XP share off was that now Game Freak could properly balance these games for that. And I have to say that that is absolutely not the case. JRPGs are notoriously open in that regard, giving you the option to grind levels pretty much immediately, so that even with a system that scales experience points, you can still very easily overlevel if you want to. And for Sword and Shield, where basically everything you do, except for raid battles, gives you experience points, and where you can basically spend hours in the wild area from pretty much the get-go, you end up being in a weird situation where you want to play the game and enjoy yourself, but will constantly think about the fact that you might overlevel, making an already easy game even easier. The way I tried to handle this was to basically use two different teams, one for all the main stuff in progress, another for the backtracking and exploration of the wild area. Still, the balancing was weirdly off at sometimes, until it fell apart completely near the end. By the third gym my team was 1 to 3 levels above my opponents, by the fourth gym they were 2 to 4 levels above me. And around the time I got to the Dark-type gym, pretty much everything besides the gym leader was much lower level than my team. And the pacing issues have an effect on this as well. Since you only have 1 or maybe 2 battles between the 7th and the 8th gyms, you don't really have a change in levels. And for some reason Raihan's team during the gym battle is the same level as Marnie and Hop during the Champion Cup. I know there's only the pathetic route 10 between the gym and the cup, but really? And then after all the story and the rest of the battles, Leon's team was 5 levels above mine, which made for a fun fight, but doesn't feel like it was intended as such. It feels like that if you completely ignore the wild area and the catching of Pokemon there and on the routes, the balancing doesn't quite work because you'll be far over leveled before the 4th gym, but after that you'll be under leveled until it all falls apart around the 7th gym. And all that is made even weirder once you notice that wild Pokemon on the routes can sometimes be even higher leveled than the trainers you fight there. It's like they wanted us to use as many Pokemon as we could, especially with being able to access our boxes from everywhere, but didn't really put in any content for us to actually use all the Pokemon, either in battle or otherwise. It makes these games and your own team feel weirdly shallow, which isn't helped by the fact that these are pretty much the shortest Pokemon games we got in a long while. Both Sun and Moon and X and Y took longer and had more stuff for you to do, before and after the credits. What might help you feel more attached to your Pokemon is the new feature of Pokemon Camp. And by new, I mean basically repurposed animations from Pokemon Ami or Pokemon Refresh from previous versions. Just without the petting and the feeding, and instead with balls, a wiggly thing and curry. Oh, and instead of only seeing one Pokemon at a time, your whole team runs around jollily and can even interact with one another. When it was first announced, I actually wanted to make a video about Pokemon Camp, because to me it has the potential to be an incredibly iconic feature. Think about it, before the introduction of Pokemon Ami or the follower Pokemon of Heart Gold and Soul Silver, you could basically not interact with your partners at all. The only way to use them in game were either in battles or later in stuff like contests. Compared to the TV show, that was incredibly limited and felt very frustrating to me because the bond between trainers and the Pokemon is supposed to be this important thing. Even NPCs in the games talk about that. And while the addition of stuff like Pokemon Umi was great, it was still incredibly limited. Still, it offered a much more personal connection to your Pokemon and might be the most impressive part of the game when it comes to the animations of them. They're full of personality and cuteness, and I spent a lot of time trying to see most of them throughout all the games. And now Pokemon Camp takes another step in the right direction in my opinion, because again the team part of you and your Pokemon is always implied and talked about directly in a TV show, but the games have absolutely nothing like that. In fact, besides battling, there is basically no way for two Pokemon to interact with one another, and that feels incredibly wrong, doesn't it? Pokemon Camp is the first time in the franchise history that you can see a detailed version of your team actually interacting with one another, and it's cute as heck. But still way too limited for my taste, which is understandable. Looking at it from a strictly technical level, your Pokemon don't do anything other than walk or run around and use the standard happy and sad animations that they already used in Pokemon Umi. For the Wigglytoy they use their standard attack animation, and when playing with the ball it's just being stuck to one specified part of their body. When looking at those limitations, because remember every new animation has to be made for all included Pokemon, so they couldn't just add dozens of new ones for everyone, it's very easy to see why Pokemon Camp leaves so much left to desire. The Pokemon interact way too little with one another, and it feels really weird that even though the Switch has a touchscreen and the Let's Go games made it work too, there's no way to pet your Pokemon anymore or clean them like in Sun and Moon. So in that regard, Pokemon Camp might even be considered a slight step back in some regards, but I hope the general idea stays, because the potential is enormous. Just a little detail of the speed at which a Pokemon moves gives them so much personality, it's amazing. But speaking of potential, I feel like Pokemon Camp works on a whole different level as well. By cooking curry, you can not just fill your curry decks, but also heal your entire team. And I was, and still am, fascinated by the idea this feature puts in my head. Because can you imagine a gigantic Pokemon game where you can't just go back to the Pokemon Center with 2 button presses and get fully healed for free, and instead have to rely on buying ingredients to cook and heal your Pokemon yourself while venturing through the wilderness? Can you imagine having to set up your camp and skip through the night because it is actually dark and dangerous to progress at night because strong Pokemon are everywhere? In such a game, the idea of camping and cooking could be used to great effect in my opinion, and it doesn't even have to stray too far from the way Pokemon games are now. If the wild area was just a little bit bigger, the quick travel a bit less accessible, and cooking curry a bit less overpowered, this might completely overhaul the regular Pokemon gameplay experience, and I'd love to play that kind of game. One feature that already has completely overhauled my priorities in a Pokemon game is the character customization. Before release, it seemed that this game would have the best character customization of the whole franchise, and I would have loved for that to be true, but to me, it's sadly only on pretty much the same level of Sun and Moon, and not the much wanted improvement. First off, we still only get to choose between 2 characters with 4 skin colors each. This is way too limited a choice, and even if Game Freak wanted to, understandably, keep character creation in the beginning as simple as possible, something like the way it works in Splatoon would be much preferred. Just more skin colors and maybe even different faces or sizes would be the logical next step, and I hope they take it. I do appreciate that your mother now changes appearance to match you though, instead of being designed to kinda work for every choice. Still, the ways to customize your character after the initial screen aren't perfect either. It's great to see a clothes shop right in the first village, with a hair salon and a second boutique in the first city, but to me the available clothes were never quite enough. Like even with everything unlocked, there aren't even plain t-shirts in all colors available, only the ones with some cute motifs on them. And if you want these designs, but not on a t-shirt, but something with longer sleeves, you're out of luck, just like in Sun and Moon. Smaller backpacks are also not available for the boys, as aren't any of the makeup options, and it takes way too long to be able to buy regular shoes. If you want to spread customization options out over the entire game, you should start with the most basic choices for the first couple of shops, and then expand into more specialized stuff later on, like they do with the leather stuff you can only get in Winden. And for some reason there isn't an option to have your character have natural red hair, even though some NPCs have it, meaning Game Freak has to be aware it exists. So why is it not an option? At least version exclusive clothes or colors aren't a thing anymore. The uniforms were surprisingly engaging though, and when I found the shop to buy all the uniforms for all different types, I was really happy with all the designs. It's a shame though that you are forced to wear a uniform for most of the important battles of the game. This makes sense, but that you can't even customize what kind of uniform to wear is seriously a missed opportunity. The same can be said about the league cards, which I had a lot of fun collecting and reading the character backgrounds on their backsides. Creating them for my own character was also way more fun than I would have thought, but I wish they would be used as an avatar for the YCOM instead of the generic images. That would have made it feel a lot more like the PSS from X and Y. I now want to talk about linearity for a bit, because I hotly speculated, just from looking at the map and thinking about the wild area, that Sword and Shield might be a return to a more non-linear approach to Pokemon games. Even the way the gym badges are awarded to you, filling out a metal frame, makes you wonder if this was actually planned during development. One way or the other, the game shoots that hope down very quickly, by explaining that for the gym challenge you have to win the badges in a particular order. That leads to there being way too many roadblocks during the main story, most of which don't make sense to me in the slightest. Like, I literally do not understand what would be so bad about being able to reach Felbury or even Hammerlock early. There's nothing in these cities to warrant locking them off, and you can basically never get lost anyway, so what's the point? And why couldn't they just allow us to get the badges in any order, or at least a little more freely? Like, the first 3 you can get in any order, then you proceed to Hammerlock and can get badges 4 to 7 in any order once again. It would have been real easy to write the story of the game in such a way that the events of Stow-on-Site and Kirchester could happen at any order, both enhancing our understanding of the legend in a different way. But nope, everything has to happen exactly the same way for everybody, and if you want to explore ahead, you can easily do so in the wild area, but nowhere else. And this is once again a thing where the non-existence of HMs becomes obvious, because they were an easy to understand, and even more importantly, easy to accept way to gate certain areas of the map. Now the game has to resort to putting Team Yell everywhere and turning your character forcibly around just because there are 2 people talking about irrelevant things east of the first Pokemon Center in Motorstoke. And while I'm not one to criticize the amount of cutscenes used for story or character development purposes, there are a couple of weird scenes in this game. Like in the beginning, just after you got the Pokédex from Sonia, there's a weird man who stops you and gives you a potion for basically no reason. I expected the game to reveal later on that that person was Looker or someone else who might come up later, but nope, it's just a random guy who for some reason just has to stop you in your tracks, right after being stopped in your tracks and just before being stabbed in your tracks again, just to give you a random potion. It's genuinely weird and I have no idea why the scene exists. I also have no idea why the scene with the detective in one of the hotels in Kirchester exists, but I absolutely love it. Mostly because it is one of the few remnants of the side quests that they really started doing in Sun and Moon and greatly expanded on in the Ultra versions. That was actually one of my favorite things these games did. Sadly, Sword and Shield scale it way down, to there only being very few side quests, with many of them being pretty lame. Like for some reason there's this weird puzzle in Turffield, which I never figured out myself and even now think is just terribly bad, or delivering food for the restaurant in Halbury, which you can only do in post-game though and easily miss it. I nearly did, had I not wondered how to get the lucky egg. I love side quests, and I really wish Pokemon would expand in that regard, and then hopefully also include a journal to keep track of all of it. That way you can make the cities feel more involved, and put story and character interactions into the game without forcing it on everyone. The last thing I want to talk about in this review is the tournament that happens at the end of the game, replacing the Elite Four. At first I was very happy about that, because I always wanted to end the game with a grand tournament, having all important characters of the story come back and fight at this huge event. And I was even more excited when I saw all the unique NPCs they created for the ceremony in Motorstoke and beyond, hoping for a really big thing with maybe 64 trainers facing off against one another. But nope, of all the Gym Challenge participants there's only 4 that even got that far, with ourselves, Marnie, Hop, and an unspecified 4th person who is never even seen. It's so lame and boring, but I guess they felt it was okay because just after that there's another different tournament with us as the winner and most of the gym leaders, deciding who gets to battle Leon. It's so lame. In post-game, this is where you battle and most probably grind for money instead of at the Elite Four, and all of a sudden there's all these new people who you have seen throughout the game as gym challengers, all with their unique looks, animations and teams. Why not have them participate in the tournament at the end of the game and have the gym leader rematches only happen in post-game? Why don't they use Dynamax? And why only limit the tournament to 8 people, meaning you will only ever fight 3 times in a row? Since you get healed between every fight, this makes it all so much easier and unimpressive than the Elite Four battles of games past. This tournament has been such a letdown that it's really hard for me to see the positive aspects of it. And that's basically what I feel about so many things in Sword and Shield. And I could go on for hours and hours, talking about how technical records are terrible in many ways, but still somehow fun to collect. or how disappointed I am with the battle backgrounds in this game, especially compared to Sun and Moon, which did a much better job with them on much more limited hardware. I could talk about other small quality of life changes, like making the time of day fixed during the main story, or how much easier it is to get competitive ready Pokemon, or how the graphic designers put so much effort into creating so many objects that resemble Pokemon and perfectly fit into the world. I could lament about how little music there is, especially for all the northern routes, or how little of the Pokédex you have actually filled at the end of the game with so few trainers to fight, how much more obvious the disappearing trainer models in battles are because the camera isn't as smartly placed during the attacks as it was on the 3DS, or how the empty lots from Sun and Moon are now basically places we can't visit, like the Hammerlock School, the fire station in Motorstoke, all the houses of Turffield, or the Dugtree Monument. But the last thing I want to talk about is the Pokemon cut. I've been skeptical if it was planned since the beginning, and right now I would love to believe that it was all a technical problem of importing the models to newer hardware, meaning they had to fix them manually, which would have taken too long for all Pokemon. But I keep thinking about one of the interesting positive things that could have come from the Pokemon cut. The potential for a huge leap in quality or quantity of other features. No one can deny that having to have everything compatible with nearly 1,000 different models and having to test them for everything is going to be a lot of work. So with only featuring about 400 Pokemon in the base game, that might have freed up a lot of time for interesting new features and content. But then why are Sword and Shield so bare bones? Probably because, like I said, I don't think this was planned, but was something they had to deal with late in development, meaning there wasn't really any gain from the cut. So I think, should the next Pokemon game not go back on this decision, we might actually see some improvements in terms of quality, especially now that Game Freak started to do DLC, which should clean up their schedule quite a bit, hopefully. But we can't always excuse things by hoping that the next game is going to be better, because that never leads anywhere good. So where does that leave us now? Do I like Sword and Shield? Are they as bad and problematic as so many people claim they are? Well, I do like them, but I also like Culloden, so that doesn't mean anything, does it? Compared to previous Pokemon games, especially X and Y and Diamond and Pearl, this game has the same kind of problems. Bad pacing, bad story, blind region, and just overall a lack of engaging features. But compared to Sword and Shield, Diamond and Pearl had way more potential that Platinum eventually got to use. They had a gigantic region with a lot of post-game content, they had a story that kinda worked at least, and just needed some tweaks and new scenes to be good. And X and Y, as the first 3D games, didn't have the problem of the Pokemon cut or unpopular online features, so even if Sword and Shield would have gotten a third version, I don't think it would have remedied enough of the issues it has to make everyone like these games. Because even if you do like them, you have to admit that there just isn't a lot of stuff there. Like, compared to Sun and Moon, Sword and Shield have less content in pretty much every regard. Less Pokemon, less battles, less places, less characters, less features. And I know more isn't always better, but in terms of characters and places, Alola exceeds Galar in every regard. And where Pokemon are concerned, I like both of them equally, and the constricting story and linearity of Sun and Moon are to me much more appealing than the still very limited freedom of Sword and Shield, but without the story, characters and personality, leaving just boredom and emptiness most of the time. And while the DLC and updates might fix things, I very much doubt that stuff like Rose and the story, or even the missing Dragon-type gym might ever be fixed. At least Sun and Moon got the Ultra versions that made the trials much better and even added one. So honestly, you should see this video much more as a defense for Sun and Moon than anything. Please go back and play these games again and see how much better they are than Sword and Shield and how much more Pokemon games can be. And then imagine that on modern hardware with a cutscene skip and no cut Pokemon. That's the Pokemon game I want. And I also think that's the Pokemon game that Game Freak wants to make. Let's hope we get to see it one day. Thank you for watching.